Hello, everybody, and welcome to our in-session webinar, Portfolio as Practice. We have approximately 250 guests from 34 countries joining us today. Before we introduce you to our esteemed speakers, Jerry, Gary, and Richard, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items. First thing is that today's webinar is being recorded. We'll share the recording on our event page at some point next week. We also invite you to ask your questions by using the Q&A function. You can upvote any questions that you like, and we will endeavor to get through as many questions as we can as time allows. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming our speakers. I'm going to hand you over to Richard, who is going to start today's conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jo. Thank you, and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. So, my name is Richard Nash. I'm a tutor, research on the graduate diploma. I'm also a practicing designer, artist, predominantly within artist books. I also wear many other caps: curator, editor, and so on. Now, part of my role has also been to design and very much lead the portfolio short course, which is particularly why I'm here today leading this session. What I'd now like to do is hand over to Jerry and Gary, respectively, to introduce themselves. So, Jerry.
I'm going to go straight into my presentation, if that's okay, because I think that is, are you okay with that, Gary? Yeah, because I think that is probably the sort of like easiest way of actually sort of going into who I am and why I'm speaking here in the way that I'm going to speak. We're going to talk about practice, and in my own practice, like Gary, and Richard, I wear several hats. So yes, I position myself as a curator. I'm an editor, and I'm also a lecturer. And for me, those kind of things are interconnected. But I'm sort of mainly sort of going to talk about my perspective in relation to how I see my practice in trying to sort of like work through the challenges that sometimes gives. So I thought I'd start with two images that are basically shots from my bookcase on my right hand side, and this is a selection of publications that I have worked on over time. And thinking about this, that immediately sort of poses in certain ways a series of challenges, because when you look at those books, when you look at the covers, the back cover, the spines, my name doesn't appear. That then immediately sort of doesn't give me an identity crisis, but does raise the issue, well, who am I when indeed I talk about my practice in relation to art, in relation to curating, in relation to publishing. So I wanted to sort of start by also talking about how I actually rolled into this, because when we think about practice, it's very, very rarely a linear trajectory. So when I talk about publishing and think about how you sort of like can publish in relation to your practice, or how you make your practice visible as a creative practitioner, I rolled into it by accident. I rolled into it by accident when I moved to the UK in '96, and I was looking for a job in the art world, and I found one with an arts organisation called Art Angel. And what I ended up doing there was commissioning, producing publications in relation to individual projects. So we think about practice. Of course, this was about the artists concerned and their practice and their particular kind of projects, and trying to think through, well, what do we make visible? How do we translate what happened in those projects visually in something that is another medium, because publishing is a particular kind of medium where actually a lot of different kind of practices can converge, certainly when we talk about the arts. Now, in this case, this was publishing in relation to a commissioning organisation, so not a traditional museum, not a traditional gallery space, but also an organisation where the notion of context was incredibly important. So also think about, well, what does context do in relation to where it becomes manifest, and what do you do with that when you think about publishing. So that was one context where I started to really think about, well, indeed, how do we make practices that are very diverse, visible and accessible beyond the event of an art project? That may be one day, that may be happening over a longer period of time. So that was one context in which I really sort of started to sort of think about, well, what does publishing do in relation to creative practices? A while later, I worked with another organization, an artist book publisher, where the whole notion of artwork, publication, mediation of practice, publishing in relation to practice, is sort of like all rolled into one. The artwork is the publication, is the kind of manifestation of a mode of practice in these kind of instances. And I oversaw a whole series there called Fabrications, in which indeed different kind of practices were positioned in the framework of publications. So having worked in those completely different kind of contexts, but also coming at this kind of practice of publishing in relation to creative practices from a different kind of background, really has given me a lot of food to really think, well, how do we think about our practice? How do we enter a field of practice? And how do we position ourselves within the field of practice? So I'm going to sort of like try and think that through a bit more sort of schematically. So when I think about practice, I also think about notions of field. Now, I trained as an art historian. Art history has a long kind of trajectory and different kind of histories and different kind of traditions. And depending on how you practice as an art historian and where you practice and what you focus on, it has very particular kind of conventions. And as people practice, they also develop habits, preferences. But there's also a lot of assumptions and expectations. And usually when we enter a field, we have certain kinds of assumptions and expectations as to what might happen when we become practitioners in that field. And as we are practicing, those kind of assumptions sometimes get confirmed, but sometimes also challenged. And that leads us to doesn't actually matter what kind of field we operate in. Very often also think about, well, what is my mode of practice? Where very often when we start practicing, we think about intentions, we think about outcomes, we think about contexts and networks that we operate within, and processes that are involved in those particular kind of ways within particular kind of fields. What very often we don't necessarily start to think about necessarily is notions of value. How do we practice? What does that mean? What do we focus on? And thinking about sort of different fields, when we think about art, very often we can think about it in isolation as an autonomous kind of practice, whereas other kinds of practices like graphic design or architecture very often are contingent on actually briefs and frameworks that actually put demands and expectations on a mode of practice. So for me, this sort of like puts a very complex set of interrelations already together when just thinking about, well, who am I? How am I sitting in this field? What does it mean to call myself a curator or an editor? And on top of that, there's also the whole issue or concerns around terminologies. Very often we enter a field, I very often see that with younger practitioners, but also people who have been practicing for years, that they feel they have to talk about their practice in a certain way. Certain topics become fashionable or come to the forefront, and people start to use certain kind of terminologies in relation to their own practice, and that leads to certain ways of speaking and also writing. And then thinking about notions of mediation and translation. A lot of people rely heavily on visuals, but when we talk about process or value, how do you actually make that visible? what linguistically can you sort of do? How do you write or think or talk about your practice that could actually make that more accessible? So when I think about my own practice related to art and curating, that is very much a practice that is very contingent also on different practices coming together, artists coming together with curators. Now, in my particular kind of niche area in relation to art and curating, that is then also situating that in publications, and a lot of that is printed. So different kind of traditions, histories, networks, etc., coming together there. Also different kind of expectations. And I think it's in that interconnecting, that convergence of different skills, backgrounds, traditions, etc., that interesting things can happen, but also interesting kind of challenges can arise. So I'm going to sort of very quickly hop and skip through a couple of examples, not necessarily to expand on them at length, but also to sort of illustrate that indeed making something visible, trying to mediate or translate something from an artistic practice into the medium of a publication. I've also been able to think about that by working with certain artists numerous times. So Shazad Dawood is an artist based here in the UK who has a very diverse practice. He paints, he makes films, he makes installations, sculptures, etc. And the first project that I worked on was an artist book. So the book was the work, but it was a book related to a film, and not so much what the film in the end looked like, but very much focusing, well, how can we talk about the process of making a film? Particularly because in this case, he wanted to converge the genre of a zombie movie with a Western. So it's a zombie Western. And trying to sort of think through, well, what do you do when you translate that into the form of a publication? Several years later, I worked with him on a catalogue, a more traditional kind of publication, giving an overview of his entire practice. So then it becomes a matter of what do you select? What do you make visible? What part of the practice? How do you make that visible? But also, who do you ask to write about that practice? What does that then allow to indeed expand on that practice? And in a more recent, the most recent publication, that was a publication linked to an exhibition, but where the publication was actually produced before the exhibition and actually fed into thinking about, well, how do you curate an exhibition about a topic? And the whole thinking through the topic happened through actually editing, producing this publication. But then having here 3 examples of actually different kind of manifestations in relation to an ongoing practice really make me think about, well, what is then the function indeed of thinking through how publishing can make certain things visible. With younger artists, a platform through which I encounter artists who are sort of like entering the field is the organisation New Contemporaries, which is a selected kind of exhibition that happens every year where people entering the field coming out of art school can submit examples of their practice. Once they're selected, an exhibition tours, and every year there's also a catalogue which now also happens digitally. And thinking about sort of entering a field of practice and thinking about notions of expectations and assumptions, I very much engage with the texts that artists submit to frame the work that is selected, to frame their practice. And that is always a really interesting kind of process, because what I really see is that people assume that they have to talk about about their work in certain ways, that they have to use certain kind of terminologies, that they have to sort of phrase things in a certain way, that they have to use really a particular kind of language. And I tend to sort of quite challenge that. It's very often it's like, well, what does this word mean for you? Does that really represent your practice? What does that do in relation to actually the images that also represent, that are part of your portfolio of your practice as it has become manifest today. And I think those kind of challenges of thinking through, well, what is my practice now? And what is important in my practice? What do people know about me, or what do I want them to know about me, is an ongoing question. So these are sort of 3 screenshots from Instagram, which is a fabulous medium in itself to think about, what do I make visible about me, myself, and my practice. The first one on the left is a cover of a book by Isabel Nolan, Curling Up with Reality. And it's a comment by an American art critic, Barry Schwartzky, who says, I've had this book for almost a year, but it's taken me until now to get beyond looking at the pictures to discover that Isabel Nolan is not only an outstanding artist, but also an inspiring writer. And for me, that kind of statement is really interesting, because indeed, so often, there's only a part of our practice or certain layers of our practice that people know us through. And Isabel's attempt to sort of like really sort of say, well, hang on a bit, writing is also absolutely part of my practice. I want to make that visible. So I work with her on making a selection, working through, well, what do you then do if you have a whole body of writing in trying to make that visible as very much part of your practice. Olivia Plender's website, I work with her, or I had worked with her on a book in the past in relation to a series of exhibitions. She came to me and said, well, my work is actually not visible in the way that I would like it to be on the web. I would like to develop a website. So again, with her practice, we really sort of said, okay, what's important to you? And she came to the conclusion, because a lot of her work is issue-based, is about collaboration, is about process, to really try and define her practice through a series of strands. And under each strands, a series of works is brought together. And some works feature in several strands because there are areas of overlap. So it's also about thinking through, well, how can you make your practice in a broader sense navigable? How can people access that complexity in something like a platform, like a website? And the last one is an example that I'm right in the middle of working with Catherine Bohm and 2 editors, trying to think through, well, she had an exhibition last year at the showroom here in London. And she said when she was invited, I don't want to make another project. And she literally brought everything that she'd accumulated in relation to her practice into the gallery space in an attempt to really think through what is still valuable. And now in relation to that project, but also looking at that broader practice, we're talking about over 2 decades of practice, trying to think through, well, what is indeed still of value now from her perspective as a practitioner now, where of course you don't necessarily do that always continuously in the process of producing. But it's a useful kind of project to think about that thinking about, well, what is my practice never stops. It's an ongoing process. To sort of almost round off, thinking about curating art, publishing, there's also more and more publishing that is becoming part of the field through the discourse that it generates, through indeed conferences, but also then anthologies that are published after conferences. On the left, there are 3 that I've worked on with editors. So again, my name is not on the cover. My name is only in a colophon, but I'm integral to really having shaped these publications in relation to how people think about their practice from their perspective, and on the right, 2 other recent examples that I also worked on. So going back to my own thinking about my own practice and how I situate myself in the field in a sort of, slightly difficult way, because indeed I'm not an artist, I'm not a curator, I'm reliant on my collaborations with all those others. I've come to sort of the conclusion that actually collaboration and process and values are really sort of like aspects that now dominate my thinking about how I situate myself in the field, where indeed how I describe myself is maybe still a very long sentence, but where that sort of focus has shifted from what have I produced towards how have I produced that with other people, and what does that mean, and how we can think about how we situate ourselves in collaboration with other practices, with other traditions, etc. So I'm going to stop there.
Thank you very much, Jerry. Really interesting and enlightening presentation.
Probably talked for too long.
Worth every word. Perhaps without sort of pause in between, Gary, if I could move straight to you in terms of your presentation.
Yes, of course. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you, Jerry. That was great. Really exciting and really sort of, I think it sort of cuts a lot across things that I'm talking about from a different perspective. So first of all, my name is Gary Clough. I'm the head of programs for the Graduate Diploma Program. The Graduate Diploma Program by nature is to enable students to position themselves within practice. So I think a lot of the things that we've been discussing today are very relevant to that. And also this notion of the portfolio, both in terms of taking you into professional practice or onto further studies, key to the way that we work academically. And like Jerry, I have many hats, as well as the academic. I'm a practicing artist, trained as a sculptor. But predominantly, I work with drawing. And in that sense of publishing yourself, I think the sketchbook is probably that point where you're publishing to yourself. And this, for me, this sketchbook is a virtual studio, somewhere that I find myself possibly in some senses around availability of time, you know, using tremendous amounts of that sort of liminal time in our lives, whether it's on the bus or the tube or early mornings with a coffee. But it's a place to sort of like set out practice. But my practice really does continually sort of like question this notion of fitting things in, but using a language of objects. So in some ways, as a sculptor, I'm probably it's that question, if it's drawn, does it have to be made? And if it's within the context of a publication, even though it's focused towards an individual audience. But I do actually use this as a vehicle very much through Instagram. And it's interesting to see how Jerry talks about Instagram as well as a sort of a publishing tool, because and a way of developing a broader audience. This aspect of continual practice is something that is key to the way I work, and it's that sort of questioning of doing, producing, depositing and cataloguing and archiving, and also that notion of a repetitive and reworking of images and shapes, patterns and forms. And it sort of led me really from this is, that traditional notion of a sketchbook as a place where you put things that are then going to be realized. And for most of my practice, I see the sketchbook as a thing in its own right. But I have been working a lot with this notion of the transcription, both the transcription of the world that I inhabit and how I record that and how I imagine it, but also how then transcribing it into a particular practice. And that drew me to embroidery and working with thread and textiles. One of the draws of this sort of process, these are cross stitches, is this sense of that expectation of being busy. Something that, cross stitch and embroidery was often associated with, whether it was rehabilitating people after sort of conflicts, whether it was associated very much in terms of, gender-based activities of certain sort of generations. And also this notion of the sampler. Sampler is something that's built up over time and has a sort of both a taxonomy, but also a mathematics in terms of the way that something is laid out and multiplies. The other aspect of these is that these were very much collaborations with embroiderers. So yes, I have put needle to thread, soon to discover that somebody else could work with me who knew what they were doing. And I've worked exclusively with an embroiderer called Lynette Hannon, who's been a key part of this work. And this is variegated thread. So as you embroider, the coloration is driven by the thread itself. And for me, that sort of led it and connected back to the sketchbook and that notion of, I suppose, the portfolio, something that is built over time, but also compartmentalized. And this sort of compartmentalization has taken me into a new body of work called Residue. This is using black and white variegated thread. And this sort of piece, obviously in its entirety on the right, was built up piecemeal. So these elements were sort of like literally almost in a tray that were then sort of brought forward and sort of, I suppose, tessellated together. What's interesting about it in terms of its sort of notion of residue, it seems to be a residue of something, whether it's an activity or whether it's actually a residue of something like a plan or map. And I think, again, in terms of this notion of either publishing or curating, how we continually map and how something is always live, how something is never actually sort of like complete. And for me, again, the thread and the embroidery really lends itself and does lend itself to that way of thinking. I'm now going to go on to talk about this piece that's recently developed. This is called Block. This was, again, just blocking shapes around and bringing these various sort of pattern-based or I suppose decorative-based elements, which were drawn from a myriad of different sources. A lot of the work that I draw from is from a nomadic sort of existence that I've been very fortunate to have, working in many different countries and many different sort of cultural landscapes. But I think for me, this again sort of works differently to the sketchbook, but still draws from the sketchbook and draws from that sense of landscape and metaverse, is that even though it's within a sort of traditional sampler-based nature, it suggests this layering and breaking up of the ways that of thinking and producing work. This is another page from one of my sketchbooks, and this really was very much around this notion of identification. And I suppose in some ways returning to that notion of if something's drawn, does it have to be made? These sort of silhouettes, ID silhouettes, not dissimilar to those that you might find in classification tables through many different subject areas, whether it's from engineering, architecture, or even in a sense of military ordnance. And these were very much things that were happening on the train, and they were sort of these sort of scribbled shapes, these sort of silhouettes of things that were sort of like half glimpsed from windows and sort of hybridized together. So actually I found really what was really intriguing by this were these mark making. So again, working with Hannah, we sort of started developing this idea of actually laying out, but thinking about how to use a varied range of sewn embroidered thread work to actually sort of talk to the notion of transcribing this activity, but also keeping it at the same scale. And what's exciting again is the use of threads. So again, these are both variegated threads, but also different levels of thread as well, different types of thread that bring something to the mark making. And I think what's exciting for me is when you see this sort of, this is obviously a work in progress, and you see the sort of work in practice. But once they're blocked out, the forms take on this really quite sort of unusual and sort of familiar, yet sort of uncertain sort of place. So they're sort of floating in space, though they are clearly intended to be sort of have weight or three-dimensional or have links to the three-dimensional. And again, this notion of the periodic table or the sex or a sort of a hierarchy of objects. And I think for me, bringing it full circle into this notion of how you publish stuff is that quite often this sampler is something that would very much be something that was very much, you may all know the home sweet home sort of situation, but this sort of artifact that would be in a domestic situation. And again, it draws across so many different cultural perspectives of a sort of a known and expected sort of thread language, but combined with this notion of, I suppose, sequential taxonomy of thinking, which is integral to the sketchbook. And for me, that sort of link to the portfolio is key, and some of the things I'd like to talk about today. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Gary. Thank you very much. Again, a really interesting and quite insightful presentation, a real difference in terms of the portfolio, although some really clear threads as well. I suspect this idea of sort of curation is very much going to run through all three of our presentations, and maybe we'll sort of pick up on some of the points in the Q&A afterwards. So if I could share my screen, and I'll just talk through a couple of my own projects. Are you seeing my screen? Brilliant, thank you very much. As I briefly mentioned when I sort of done my initial introduction, I'm a man of many caps. I'm a designer, editor, artist. Over 25 years, developed sort of different strands to my own practice. For the last 10 years, I've really worked on being an artist and very much working on the artist book as being a primary medium for my work. And it was really interesting, Jerry, to hear your sort of position of working with artists around the nature of artist books. And it's actually something where I draw a lot of parallels actually to the portfolio as being both kind of a notional practice, but also a practice-based publication. Now, for the two examples that I'm going to talk to, they're very much new pieces of work or recent pieces of work. And it's very much drawing out this idea of curation or sort of methodologies and approaches for sort of diagnostic in a manner. So to sort of understand the body of material, the sort of steps and processes you might go through. Now, as a maker, and I am a maker, and as much as Gary, I get excited by the feel of a piece of stock, the nature of the thread I'm using, the type of binding. However, with both these projects, actually, it's not really the outcome where I'm interested. It's much more about the design of the process. So a sort of method or methodology for working with other artists and designers in collaboration, but particularly this idea of co-production. So many perspectives into one particular idea or concern or challenge. Now, this process in every respect is not just revealing for me, sort of working with others and the nature of the artist book, but with the current audience in mind, and coming back to the idea of the portfolio, the different methods and approaches that I'm going to talk to are very much then informed different key sessions within the actual teaching of the portfolio course, and namely one which I loosely refer to as constellation, conversation and collaboration. And my last slide will really sort of talk to this idea of constellation. So let's just move forward through the slides. Sorry, bear with me. So as the first piece of work was very much a co-produced zine, experimental zine as a research method. So it's not really about the artifact, and in fact, there is no outcome. It is the manifestation of the research as it sits at the moment. Now, to give a bit of context, this started in March 2020, just as we went into kind of remote lockdown conditions. Any prior planning between myself and the other collaborators had sort of been very much sort of ripped up. Start again, how do we make this work, mediating through different spaces and largely digital and working entirely online. Now, one of the aspects that I developed was this idea of a collaborative tool, a robot or a piece of code that essentially worked to collate, to fragment, to modularize, to find kind of its own connections. Now, this idea of the non sequitur was important within the actual research as well, but was really helpful in terms of understanding the nature of what this code was doing, in the way in which it was modularizing, fragmenting and piecing back together. And the idea being sort of revealing within the body of contributions new connections that we may have not seen ourselves. Now, to move through fairly quickly, this is essentially just a very sort of brief screenshot of both the code in action and the processes that I took to develop the content with those collaborators in the first instance. So I ran a series of workshops. I used a collage narrative method, predominantly using storyboards. So I'm asking the participants to actually reflect on the subjects that we were discussing, but communicate those via sort of storyboards, and very much the idea of kind of characters, character development, narrative and storytelling sort of came to the fore. And what the robot is essentially doing is kind of cutting up those storyboards and then reconfiguring them. It's clearly not infinite. There are only so many combinations, but the chance involved is obviously much greater. Now, to then give you a sort of sense, so from this sort of very quick-paced environment, so being online via Zoom, delivering sort of very fast-paced workshops, what came out of that collaborative tool was a first moment of really kind of looking at everything that had been reconfigured and then piecing it back together into a zine-like format. Now, what that then allowed us to do was slow the pace down. So this was then sent via postal mail service right across the UK and indeed to Berlin, and in fact actually got lost, note to self, on future projects where I feel like using the postal service. What happens when your precious one-of-a-kind body of research disappears and is nowhere between Dublin, Berlin and London, somewhere between, not identifiable. It was returned after about 3 months. Now, what this enabled each participant to do was to then really step back and actually look at what connections the robot had formed, where they saw and could then expand on. Now, expand on, yes, conceptually the content within those and make those connections more explicit, but also through the modalities that they were familiar with as part of their practice. Now, that included sound design, experimental videographers, and essentially that first slide, what it gives you a sense of is all of those contributions that have been then filtered, pieced back together, a sense of sort of logic in the way in which the sort of disparate array of materials, and again, sort of Jerry used this idea to make something visible, to curate, to sort of see that sense of the way in which the zine is then picking up the different strands of the research. Now, as I first said, it isn't about the outcome. The outcome was interesting, but actually what's more interested is the open-endedness of it, the idea that I set into this to design the process and the method, not to predefine exactly what the outcome was. And I think that is exciting. Now, as then I was sort of really thinking about the research itself and writing up that research, there were different key aspects that really came to the fore. And these are many of the things that we bring into our teaching, both on the short course, but also the graduate diploma. And I'm sure Jerry would also talk to this in terms of MA teaching as well, around knowing through making. So that being sort of a real key point, that you understand your practice through making, the importance of process, that you sort of foreground process, not outcome. And certainly within the particular body of research, the idea of going beyond linear representations, and certainly the agency of kind of physical materials as well as digital code. Now, perhaps some of those aspects I can tease out in the Q&A, but to move sort of very much onwards. So this is now a publication that I'm working on with Gary Clough, with 6 other collaborators of different disciplines. And this is very much a current work in progress. Now, building on that previous research, there was a manner in which I was able to think about that original method, those processes, think about the new set of conditions, environments, the participants involved, and really then design, having informed the process, a different process for this particular book. So building on that previous research enabled me to develop a different set of tools and approaches, this time without the challenge naturally, of remote working, where kind of co-production was central to that non sequitur publication. This sort of very much foregrounded the idea of physical iterations, physical additions that were sort of part and parcel of the development of the research. Now, as a very, very brief insight, of which you're not really seeing here, mainly because Gary's already shown you, is this started off with me photocopying over several hours selected pages from Gary Clough's sketchbooks. Now, in some respects, again, Jerry, you might sort of talk to this feeling of sitting in front of Catherine's work, filling a studio and thinking, what is of value? Now, if you're sitting with 15 years of Gary Clough sketchbooks, actually, it's probably not dissimilar. It might be several rooms, actually. So for me, it was then an initial process, which I used a kind of numerical rule just to begin identifying, selecting kind of pages. Now, without going through a sort of process of imposition, it all happened between me and the photocopier. I simply bound that book and I gave it back to Gary. Now, what Gary then did was take that further for another 14 days as a reflection tool. So there are these captured moments split as a double page spread where you might have a piece of work developed 5 years ago and a piece of work developed 15 years ago. What's that sort of point where Gary's then identifying, as he talked to, the notion of transcription, the evolution, as well as that sense of something being live. Now, I could probably talk much more, but the concept of certainly came to the fore, and that was something that Gary and I sort of really talked at length about. Is not just sort of direct notions of revisiting, but actually going back to very much the etymology of and the different sort of definitions of the prefix. Now, just to show you a couple more slides that really sort of talk to the stage of the process. So this was then into our second edition or iteration of that very first book, which was created as an edition of 8, one for each of the collaborators, who then responded in a similar 2 weeks, 14 days period of time, but through their own lens. So from product designers, artists, writers, as a huge contribution of different outputs, including, and I will say, the challenge on my part for an editor and sort of designer in this process, where someone picks apart the book, pulps it, and turns it into brand new recycled paper. Now that is a sort of, it's both brilliant, but then also how do you then kind of go back into this process of distilling and understanding what's in front of you to then begin piecing it back together again, which is why this final slide makes sense. So this is essentially where I'm up to in the process at the moment. Now, there was such a body of work developed by not only the 8 participants, but the period of time, the different iterations, the different versions, that it really needed a method to understand exactly your point, Jerry, in respect to this project around what is valuable, where are those kind of connections in this work. So I set into initial process of thematic analysis and visual content analysis, initially with the work that Gary had developed. So I was sort of picking on many of his own processes around classifications, taxonomies, looking for motifs and where these might connect different aspects through time. And time was already then embedded into the work because it started with the 15 years, but really looking at those connections that Gary had kind of made visible through working into it further. Then I sort of went through a process of then bringing in the 6 collaborators' work and really how that reshaped that initial set of sort of classifications or taxonomies. So in particular, looking at a body of writing which usefully sort of almost created these kind of anchorage points to bring the book sort of back to points where this work kind of began to be triangulated, I guess, around concepts and ideas rather than necessarily just visual motifs. Now, this idea of sort of presence and distance, about continuity and narrative and structure, all provided these useful points of reference. Now, this is the task that very much some of our students go through on the short course, and it is about finding that distance from your work, a sort of stepping back and identifying not what you think your work means, but actually what resonates within the work when you look at it differently through a different set of lenses. Now, this as a body of work, just to briefly talk to, Gary and I are just in the production of the final artist book, of which that will become a book in itself in the end. But the actual research here is what I'm, as I say, really interested in taking further, and now actually out of art and design kind of context. I've got a particular research project in mind initially, which is working with children to teach architecture, but through bookmaking and paper engineering and stories, but also to go much further than that and really see what happens when you take this as a methodology into perhaps sort of technology and science and so on. So that's briefly my presentation. So I'll stop sharing my screen. We're almost sort of up to time in terms of how much is left for the audience. So perhaps I could just maybe cue an initial question to you both. Jerry, in the first instance, if you don't mind. And I think what's really good from your presentation, as Gary picked up on, you know, you sort of spoke about sort of portfolioing as practice, and that came up in our conversation earlier. If you wear multiple caps, how do you situate your practice? Now, I'm going to come back to the portfolio in a manner from that statement. Now, leading from Catherine's body of work, what guidance would you give to students then? So them looking at their portfolio, thinking about where that portfolio is going, progression portfolio, the body of work it contains. What guidance would you give them in terms of kind of critically engaging with that work as a selection process, the sort of making visible? You're on mute, Jerry.
Yes, I realise. It's a tricky question to answer, but I'm also wondering whether it also relates to a question that's in the Q&A. And I think the moment you think about selection, you don't do that in isolation. You don't necessarily do that from, okay, this is where I think I am and this is what I select. You always do that in response to a context, or you tend to do that. It's the impetus for which you select. Whether that is an application for a course, whether that is a submission for a prize, whether that is submitting a body of work to be included in an exhibition, or whether that is just talking to somebody and finding areas of overlap and say, okay, what can I show you to convince you that we've got something to work with here? So I think it is about clarifying for yourself, and that's why I sort of like went around things quite schematically. It is trying to consider what for you at that moment in time, in that given context, is most important. The way it looks, the process, your values, what the work is trying to do in the world. And I'm particularly thinking about so much socially engaged practice where there is a very particular kind of social concern embedded in how a practice has taken shape. Catherine Bohm is an artist whose practice is very much like that. It is about collaborations. It is about rethinking the economy. It is about rethinking values, what we value in society. So a portfolio tends to be, and sometimes, as in it differs literally from practice to practice. So the moment we say portfolio practice for Gary means something completely different than it means for me, and it might mean for a curator whose practice is very much focused on creating exhibitions in an institutional context. So I think it's trying to think through, well, what do I find important in my practice in relation to the framework in which I'm going to pitch who I am at this moment in time. And yes, sometimes that is about taking stock of 20 years of practice. Sometimes that is taking stock in relation to a very particular moment or a very particular kind of body of work, or sometimes it's to do with a brief. Graphic designers, architects, so many people respond to a brief, and therefore trying to think through, well, what is relevant to select that is not just thought from within the practice, but is trying to think through, well, where does this land? That was a very long answer.
No, very good answer, very helpful answer, I'm sure. And I'm glad it's picked up that first question, of which we can obviously go back to as well. So then, Gary, just to pick up on one of the aspects that Jerry mentioned there, this sort of idea of at that moment. Now, that seems to be within your practice always, this sort of sense of transcription, but everything being live, this sort of continuous way in which something is developed and repositioned, redeveloped. Now, I guess, again, sort of similar question, sort of coming back to the portfolio, we tend to think as the portfolio, an assumption made, shall we say, around the portfolio is this is a final point of presentation. This is me, and there's possibly just a ... that there's a continuation. How do you, or what would you recommend in terms of capturing that liveness of the body of work? Gary, you're on mute, sorry.
We all do it.
It's the theme. So yeah, it's a really important question, because I think many people look at the portfolio as sort of a particular tool, which is for a very specific job or function, whether that's a particular job you're applying for, or a particular sort of commission or course or position. And well, of course it is. But then, if any of you have ever applied for a job, I'm sure the first thing you've done is copied and pasted the last one you tried for. And actually, I think it's seeing it as the body of work. And for me, that's why it's so important that the portfolio, you know, your work is a portfolio. Your work is by very default, it's a portfolio. Obviously, as somebody targeting it to a specific level, that's where there is this notion of what's needed. And, you know, this is where, you know, research comes into it, you know, where you understand what the parameters, the landscape of this particular sort of like problem, job requires. And that's why I think it's so important to see your practice as portfolio. And often I think there's a question in the chat which I really like, which is, you know, how do you do one from scratch? And I think I love the term scratch, you know, because it suggests that you've got to start again. And actually, what anybody viewing portfolios are looking for is fundamentally, who are you? They're not looking for, do you fit this particular mold? They'll look at how you may be applied to what they're looking for, but they're looking at you fundamentally. So actually, the notion of starting from scratch, from my perspective as an artist, practitioner, as a creative, it's almost impossible, because, you know, we've got more bags on the trolley than most people at King's Cross of a morning, you know. So I think I wouldn't worry about this notion of a portfolio being specific, and if anything, try very much to avoid that. Where you can be more specific is just thinking about the clarity of presentation, but to the problem or to the situation.
Absolutely, thank you. Maybe since we're now picking up on the attendees' questions, we could perhaps just ask Joe to maybe chair a few. It's good that we've picked up a couple already.
Well, can I volunteer to
respond
to the last question?
To ask you it, actually, yes, indeed.
That is about sort of like if you have multiple parts of your practice and how you sort of like try and think that through. I think that's a challenge that a lot of people have. I've been mentoring somebody recently where they're sort of mid-career, they're a curator, but where they also say, I'm a curator, I'm a writer, but I'm also a teacher, and I can see myself going into maybe more consultancy kind of projects. And he's building a website, and he was like, well, how do I approach that? And I think and I want to pick up also on what Gary said. Yeah, of course, it comes from you. And whether that is a physical sort of like practice of making, or indeed you having situated yourself like a lot of curators are working in particular kind of context, and also doing writing like the guy I've been talking to recently, but trying to think through, well, what is relevant from how you think about your own practice now? What do you value within that practice? So when I was talking to him quite early on, it's like, well, it doesn't make sense to basically chronologically present what you've been doing over the years. What do you value? And therefore, what gives us then a kind of hook to think about, well, how could we navigate this very diverse body of work? So it's trying to think through categories, and that is not necessarily, in some practices that is easier than in other practices, and that's where I go back to that example of the website for Olivia Plender, where there's whole bodies of work, and they're brought together under the header of a title of one of them in a cluster. So that is not about categorization according to medium or period of time when they were made, but really trying to think through, well, what could represent this practice holistically? But also trying to think through, well, I'm here now, but where might I be in 5 years? So also make it sort of like bulletproof to some extent for the future, so that you don't hang yourself up in a very rigid way of clustering or organization, so that it becomes really difficult to sort of pick out sections if you were to apply for something specific, or you wanted to show somebody a very particular part of your practice.
Absolutely. And in many respects, this leads us on to the last question in the Q&A chat, which I'll just read verbatim, but it does pick up on this point, and maybe we can extend your points there afterwards, Jerry. So selecting a portfolio for a particular exhibition is a specific context, but I find selecting generically for a website is hard, as I find myself working on multiple practices: art, participatory, speculative design, etc. Do you have any tips apart from separating into multiple sites identities, as I think they are all relevant? So just to sort of summarize there, if you do wear many caps, then clearly there are aspects that might be of value and concerns that cross all of those different ways in which you work. How do you represent that? How do you present that to audiences and publics and so on? So are we talking, and would you recommend multiple websites, multiple platforms from different facets of yourself, or how might you bring that together if it was a singular website, for instance?
Do you want me to answer?
Actually, I was going to just throw that, so entirely up to you.
Gary, I'm going to leave the floor to you.
I think this, again, as Jerry sort of picks on this sort of multiple sort of situation. I mean, the reality is at the moment, not at the moment, but there are so many platforms. We talked a little bit about Instagram, Jerry and I, obviously we're talking about the portfolio. I mean, the reality is as well, I think the portfolio is also this notion of something that can be plugged into as well from different other aspects. So, you may well have the website, you may well have the portfolio, and the portfolio may be a particular sort of tab within the website, it may be a particular section, whether that's sort of film-based, whether it's sort of moving image. Now, those also may be sort of available through links to Vimeo, to YouTube, they may be on Instagram. Now, I think that's really how you tie it together in a portfolio, is actually, because hopefully you haven't got too many screens open other than this one, but we work in a world where we're often doing many things at once on screen. And actually, I think now the portfolio is a broader tool. It does have a sort of a language, or I suppose a uniformity to it of expectation, both I think from you as students and practitioners wanting to sort of move into different ways of working, but also from the viewers' aspects. But I think you need to be aware that that is much less confined and constricted than you may think. And actually, anybody engaging with a portfolio, fundamentally, you have their attention because they've either asked for it or they're there to look at it and they're coming at it with an open and an engaged mind. So actually, if you've got multiple practices, there's ways of linking those in very coherently. And I think we've all changed in the way that we work over the last sort of 10, 20 years in terms of portfolios. So I suppose that would be my key piece of advice, is not to self-edit or self-restrict in terms of the portfolio and see it as something that can actually be multifaceted and see that as a bonus and not a challenge.
Yeah, I think you're very right about that. And I think it's also sort of looking at other questions when it comes to constructing a fresh contemporary portfolio. And for me, that sort of like hints, and this is not to critique the person who asked the question, but it goes back to that notions of expectations. And depending on what kind of practice we have, there is this expectation that we have to be present in and now, that we have to completely up to speed with technologies, with ways of presenting. And I think at the end of the day, it's also a continuous negotiation with yourself and a level of awareness, and say, okay, well, if certain ways of presenting are not you because it makes you feel uncomfortable, then by all means don't step away from it. Think about other ways that are more you, that feel more natural, that feel more comfortable in terms of how you want your practice to be perceived, what you find important to bring to the fore, to outline for people who engage with your practice, to really sort of stand out. And I think in that sense, I've been very lucky, as in that's also sort of age and working with a wide range of different kinds of practitioners over time. I'm really interested in those kind of people who approach sort of looking at their practice in a slightly different way, not conforming and not necessarily from an anti perspective, but really thinking through, well, indeed, what if I want to make something visible, how can I do that? And almost sort of, rather than a hindrance, use that as a leverage to be creative in that sense.
Thank you very much, Jerry. Sadly, we have actually reached the end of the session. Unbelievable. An hour has gone so quickly. I do appreciate and understand there are many more questions within the chat, and perhaps with Joe, we will be able to maybe answer some of those and package them off to you at a later point. But Joe, if I could perhaps invite you back to close the session.
Oh, that's a difficult one. I feel I've taken up so much of the speaking time already. I think it is about awareness and trying to become comfortable with who you are, how you think about your practice, but indeed not mold yourself into what you perceive to be, oh, this is what I need to be doing. And the moment you feel that you're stepping into a space in terms of how you present your practice, how you present your portfolio, and you do it because it's expected, you think it's expected in a certain way, think again and think about what is really important for you and how that could be made visible, tangible, accessible in a slightly different way. Look for examples that inspire you.
Absolutely. It's possibly the greatest piece of advice I would give any student: make work that motivates you. Now, while that's all well and said, actually understand why it motivates you. If you work out what the motivation is, then you're actually well on your way to understanding how you situate your practice. How do you talk to and do many of the things that have been brought up today? So understand why you make the work in the first place. What is it? What's important? What's of value? So that is the end of our session. So thank you everyone for joining us for this hour. Apologies, we've gone ever so slightly over, but I hope you've enjoyed and found the session interesting and useful.
Thank you.